أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الحمد لله الأول بلا أول كان قبله. All praises to Allah, Lord of all the worlds. All praise is to Allah, who was the very first and the foremost, without anyone preceding him. وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ الْآخِرِ بِلَا آخِرٍ يَكُونُ بَعْدَهُ. And all praises to that Allah, who will be the final, the ultimate, without anyone coming after him. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله. All praises to that Allah who has guided us in this way. And were it not for His guidance, surely we would not have been guided. أوصيكم عباد الله ونفسي بتقوى الله. I remind you and exhort you, slaves and servants of Allah, as I remind myself, of course, about taqwa of Allah, about being God conscious, about being reminded of Allah, about being cognizant of Allah and aware of Allah at all times. Why? As we always remind ourselves regularly on these Fridays, for three reasons. One, because Allah, being my creator, knows me better than I know my own self, which means whatever I think or I dream or I aim in my mind for something which is to my betterment, Allah knows better than that what is good for me. Secondly, however, Allah has more power over me than I have over my own self. So whatever I think I can do, I can enact, I can effect in a way to bring goodness to me, Allah has more power over me to do that anyway. But moreover, and governing those 2 points, is that Allah loves me and loves us all more than we can ever love our own selves. So being more powerful than me, than I am over myself, and being more knowledgeable about me than I am over myself, all of that is governed by His love, which means He will do what is to my betterment, because He loves me more than any mother could love her own child. It is through this love that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us many blessings. One of them is the ability to do what I'm doing now, becoming audible, making noise and sound, and we communicate with one another through sound. Of course, the era in which we live, we don't live in an era in which there is sound. We live in an era in which we are overly bombarded with sound in a way that we have to cut back, because we around us have an endless stream of noise right now. Sound to the extent is becoming noise. Even now we are not in silence, we are in noise. This blessing of Allah of sound, the ability to become audible, to hear and to speak, just as all the blessings of Allah, needs control and measure. One of the blessings of Allah is that He has allowed us to eat and nourish ourselves. But that doesn't mean because it's a blessing we should take as much of it as we can and overfill ourselves at every occasion because it's a blessing. No, we don't do that. And we recognize that that would be abuse of that blessing. And all of the blessings of Allah similarly need control and measure. And the ability to hear and to speak is the same. Sometimes we think that we cannot be effective, or the way to be most effective in any situation is to utter something, to express, and to make that sound. However, if we look at our hadith corpus, the collection of the narrations we have from the Prophet and the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, we find the plethora of narrations about the merit and virtuous aspect of the opposite of that, of silence. Of silence. And not only the hadith corpus, of course, even the ayat, the signs of Allah which are all around us, allude to this also. So, Paul Brunton, for example, notes that in nature, he says, sovereignty has been allotted to the silent forces. How is it that every evening the moon pulls millions of tons of tidal water up? without making the faintest sound. And every morning, the dark turns to light, the cold turns to warmth, the birds come out and sing. But this is all affected by the sun, which, as far as we are concerned, doesn't make a single noise. When we think about ourselves and what Allah is teaching us from His signs and from the hadith of the saints as well, that there are enormous benefits to cutting back on using this blessing of Allah, which we use so easily. You know, the English saying, loose lips sink ships. It means when you just talk and talk and talk, you never know something, you're going to say something. Of course, it's from a war analogy, that the enemy is going to hear what you're saying and going to sink your ship. You never know when you're going to say something which is going to be detrimental. Why? Because I'm just so used to talking. I don't have to talk all the time. As Amirul Mu'mineen alayhi salam says, رُبَّ كَلَامٍ أَنْفَذُ مِنَ السِّهَامِ. How often words are more piercing than arrows in terms of the damage they can cause. But the analogy of Imam Ali alayhi salam likening words with arrows goes further as well, because remember, just as the arrow, once it's shot from bow, you know, these days you have WhatsApps, you can send a WhatsApp and it has a delete function, like delete for everyone, and then no one sees that WhatsApp. When you speak, like the arrow, once it's released from the bow, and it's going to hit its target, and then you regret in that millisecond once it's left the bow, I shouldn't have shot that arrow. When now it's going to go there and cause that damage. And once the words, which are used so loosely, without thinking, are going to hit the target and cause the damage, they've already left my lips, then it's too late. Just like the arrow from the bow, I cannot retrieve it. And as the Arabic saying goes, it's not a hadith, but it's come from a fable, if you like. I'm not going to go through the whole fable because it's a bit boring anyway, but the moral is right. In the fable, at the end of it, the king says to his advisors, رُبَّ كَلِمَةٍ تَقُولُ لِصَاحِبِهَا دَعْنِي. Is how often a word says to its owner, says to the one who's speaking, leave me, don't do it, leave me alone, don't release me. How often the word says to its owner, da'ni, don't. Because once it's out, it's going to cause enormous damage. But this damage, which we often cause sometimes we realize it and we regret it. Sometimes it's caused the damage, and the person who is being damaged maybe lives in another country or has moved, or we don't even realize what damage has been done. How to reduce that risk? Well, don't speak if it's not necessary. It's that simple. When it's necessary and I need to vocalize myself, it's something different. Anything else carries a risk. Why? So if I actively, consciously try to reduce that, you will notice around you the people who speak less are revered. People who speak less are more respected. Of course, Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam has been reported to have said, in one of those hadith I was talking about, a plethora is full of them. He says, Tuba, how fortunate, how good is that person, liman amsaka al-fadl min lisanihi, whoever holds back the excess from his tongue. Fadl, actually, in convention, anything which is beyond need is fadl. If I need 1,000 pounds a month to live, then 1,000 and the first pound after that is surplus. It's not a bad thing, but in this case, it's a bad thing. Anything beyond necessary speech, even if it's a word, if it's beyond necessary, it's not good. And the Prophet says, good or fortunate is the one who holds that back. Or as his brother Amir al-Mu'mineen has said, كَثْرَةُ الصَّمْتِ تَكُونُ الْهَيْبَةِ. The one who has more silence, that person's hayba increases, means their dignity in front of people increases. So we see, even in the spiritual realm, in the realm of ethics and moral ethics, with Muslims and non-Muslims alike, they have now, in the modern times, you would have heard of this concept of detoxing. Not only detoxing from electronic devices and WhatsApp and social media, detoxing meaning going away from everyone for some time, as the Prophet ﷺ used to do, and as all the Imams. Not that all the Imams went away on the mountains at some point, necessarily, no, but they used to take time out away from everyone and everything. Because we're talking right now about the realm of the tongue and sound. But that realm is here. The spiritual benefits are here. You find that silencing the tongue more has an impact on silencing the mind and then the heart. Right now, because most of us don't silence our tongues, our minds are far from being able even to recognize what silence might look like. My mind right now is an endless stream of continuous thoughts. I have to fix the clutch on the car and take it to the thing, and after I do that, or remember I have to write that down. And constantly, you will not find in your mind, hardly anyone will find in their mind where that waterfall or stream has ever stopped. We can't even fathom what that would be like, not having that stream. And so when I come to pray, my salat, of course I cannot focus because that stream is continuously running. And I have to do this, and I have to hand in that assignment, and then I have to then go to ruku, and then come back up, and then remember I have to do that qunut as well, I have to do that. So even I'm talking, everything is going on. That stream is endless. But that starts by trying to silence here. Then it can go to the mind, and then to the heart, which learns to focus and silence itself. In a story, of course, many of these spiritual stories, we just attribute them to Rumi, who God knows if he had enough time in his life to go through all these stories in reality, but let's just give it to him anyway, because it's been attributed to him. Rumi, a young man, once came and asked him for a favor. He said, Rumi, you're such a great poet. Teach me the art of poetry so I can write poetry the way you write poetry. What's the art of poetry? Teach me. And Rumi replied to him, or insisted to him, he said, first, before I teach you that, I need to teach you the language of silence. And the young man became confused. He said, silence is not a language. Silence is a way of not communicating. I'm asking you for poetry, which is communication. And you're telling me silence, which is not communication. Silence doesn't convey, he thought. Rumi said, no, practice it. And then the young man came to realize through that practice that actually, from where we understand it as well, without practicing it, silence is not a void that we need to fill it with something. Silence is not a void that we have to fill it up. It's an empty vessel which we need to explore what's there. Sit in silence and see what's there. Don't fill it up with things. But we're not used to that. And that's why when I go for a drive, even from here to 5 miles away, 6 miles, or 1 hour away a drive, I need to put some, podcast. No, not something unbeneficial, something beneficial. Podcast, lecture, fable, story, audiobook. I need to fill my silence with something. Often, the reason behind that is because I'm afraid of the silence and what I'll find there. Life has difficult questions, existential questions, moral questions. What am I doing here? Am I doing the right thing? But all of these questions have an opportunity to pop up and trouble me when I'm silent. And I'm terrified because they're really uncomfortable to find out. And the fact that I don't have the answers to these questions, and I need to fill it with something, put music and nasheed and whatever I put on to drown out to fill that void of silence. Actually, everything beneficial in my life will happen only in that void of silence. Everything else is, I fear the questions that pop up in that silence. What's the right thing to do? Am I living the right way? My trauma from childhood, my anxieties of the future, the vices which are within, all all start becoming discovered and having space in silence. And I don't want them to come out. But to become someone more wholesome, those things need to. So, as we said, of course, silence has these benefits: spiritual, social, in that it increases your status amongst people as well. You might find in the people that you know that there might be one person who all the time, and you think, yeah, how do I get away from this person? Or, I enjoy people's company, but that individual maybe not so much. Why? Because it's just non-stop. If you don't recognize that person in your friends group, it might be you. So that's a joke. Inshallah, it's not you. Inshallah, we don't have those kind of people around us, but we don't like to be around people who talk too much, because their esteem in our eyes goes down. And of course, the spirituality of the heart is exercised through that silence as well. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to enliven our hearts and to enable us to seek out silence, enjoy it, and then reap the wisdoms that are in it. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ.
اللهم صل على محمد. اللهم صل على محمد.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي يخلق ولم يخلق. All praises to that Allah who continuously creates me at every moment, and He is in no need of being created. وَيَرَزُقُ وَلَا يُرْزَقُ. And He sustains and is not sustained. وَيُطْعِمُ وَلَا يُطْعَمُ. He feeds, but He is not fed. Is it that Allah who granted us not only the blessing of sound, but the blessing of silence? Of course, this silence that we spoke about needs to be exercised more often than not, but especially when articulating something is of less benefit than keeping silent. So when being silent is a detriment, when my silence causes damage, when my silence is dangerous, of course, at that point, it is not permissible for me to remain silent. Silence for me at that time is inappropriate. Let's assume that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King would have remained silent in the face of injustice. Of course, remember at the time, in his day, he was, in the public eye, the most reviled individual in the United States, hated. Let us assume that in the face of the injustice, Nelson Mandela remained silent. Who, of course, again, in his day, people in this country who are in the parties who are in power now had labeled him terrorist and the African National Congress as terrorists. He was hated and detested. Imagine now he's celebrated as his legacy lives on. Imagine he had remained silent in the face of these injustices. Now we have injustices that we see around us. Now imagine we remain, we don't have to imagine it because most of us are silent about them anyway. Keeping in mind, had Reverend Martin Luther King not stood up when he had the platform and the opportunity and the power to stand, he would be questionable by God. Keeping in mind where we have platform, opportunity, privilege, freedom to voice ourselves and we do not, we are answerable for that. The injustices that we spoke about was in the United States, in South Africa, what we see happening all around the world today, probably most saliently and evidently in Palestine, where we spoke about Nelson Mandela, the same kind of apartheid ideology from colonialists that were being faced by him and his people is being enacted on the Palestinian people today. The same racist ideology is being suffered by them today. In a secular democracy in which we pride ourselves that we live in, and we have abundant freedom of speech, not voicing oneself is then sinful. Here in this country, being part of this country, we owe it to the people, our people in this country, to stand up for injustice that they are facing here. Most of the people in this country are victims of injustice, of political greed, of corruption. In fact, where we are now, and we've been for the last 13 years in this country, it's difficult to imagine a government that has been more patently and brazenly corrupt than what we have today. But if we remain silent, we are answerable. That the Public Accounts Committee, if you saw what they brought out just 2 days ago, estimate that around in the past 5 years, through the COVID episode that we had as well, around 25 billion pounds have been squandered in inefficiencies and corruption. As 25 billion pounds, by the way, that they also concluded that the taxpayer will never see again. And nobody is going to be brought to justice for that. And if we don't speak, where we have freedom of speech, which are already being eroded in this country anyway, take advantage of them while you have them. And we don't speak, we are answerable for that. When we live in a time where we face the threat, existential threat, even if we don't suffer it immediately now, we don't see it now, we see 24 degrees weather outside, this is fantastic. We're not losing our jobs, we're not losing health, everything is fantastic for us. People are telling us, well, in the next few years, you might be fine, but because of your actions and your resources and the way you're using things, people in other countries are dying of drought and thirst and flooding and we're going to ask people in India or other parts of the world who are waiting, where do I get my next meal from? Please cut down on the way you're using resources. But when I go to the supermarket, it's one time I forgot my plastic bag, I might as well because my short-term plastic bag use and convenience is more important for me than the long-term survival of this planet and the millions of people who are going to be affected by it. When I have good weather and I insist on driving my diesel engine 5, 6, 7 miles when there are alternative means of transport, because my short-term comfort is more important to me than the long-term survival of someone somewhere else in the world who I don't see or need to think about, then my silence is going to be questioned. When immorality around us is so much that my children are subjected to it from wherever they look, from media, from TV, from their schools now being implemented in what's being driven into them through mandatory curriculums, and I don't speak out, then my silence should be questioned. Not by myself only. On that terrible day, it should be questioned as well. All of the instances we've spoken about in the last few minutes about injustice, corruption, immorality, are instances in which speaking out and not being silent is difficult. It's not easy. Has immense challenges. But not the challenges that we'll face in the long term, in this world and the next world, if we keep silent. As Imam alayhi salam says in Nahj Balagha about silence, that when a person is not silent and he speaks more and more and more, he becomes more prone to errors. When he becomes more prone to errors, he becomes desensitized to making those errors, and that person becomes shameless as a result because they speak truth, untruth, damaging, encouraging, whatever words come to their mind is spoken, of course. And the opposite is also the case. When I remain silent at a time when I need to talk because I'm scared or because I'm afraid of how it's going to impact me socially, politically, personally, familiarly, economically, I start to become desensitized to the corruption around me. Desensitized to the immorality around me because I'm not standing up for it. And that leads me to becoming more and more of an immoral person myself. So we pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us the courage to defy our own cowardice, often which we are facing in these ways, so that when we are to keep silent and when our silence is beneficial, we seek its wisdom from that vessel of silence. And when it is necessary to talk, we don't bow to the social pressures around, and we are able to speak up in order to combat the vices we see around us. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness for ourselves and everyone, all the mu'mineen and muslimin around us. Allahumma ghfir lil mu'minina wal mu'minat wal muslimina wal muslimat al ahya'i minhum wal amwat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin sayyidina wa rasulika Ahmad al-Mustafa. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين.